The Spin-off Podcast Network. Contact Energy's good plans give you periods of free or discounted power. The more of your current energy usage you shift to these times, the more you could save. Learn more about these plans at contact.co.nz/goodplans. Conditions, fair use policy and eligibility criteria apply. Power refers to electricity.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
When the Facts Change is brought to you by the Spin-off Podcast Network in partnership with KiwiBank, the bank for Kiwi looking to get ahead in business and in life. A bank that delivers expertise and banking know-how, smart advice for business owners wanting to invest, grow their business or diversify. A bank that adapts with technology through the lens of its people and customers. It is a bank with heart that is driven by its purpose. Kiwi, making Kiwi better off. Have you heard that line from Einstein about how the most powerful force in the universe is actually compounding interest? Well, he's right. And there's nothing more painful and compounding than interest on a mortgage. And when you're able to get a cheaper mortgage, you can save a lot of money. That's one of the key messages out of this week's interview with Brad Olson from Infometrics, who's done some research for the New Zealand Green Building Council on the cost savings of getting a green mortgage, so to speak, from ANZ with a 25 basis point discount whenever you buy a Homestar home. Now, this is a New Zealand Green Building Council specified set of improvements to make the home more efficient. And Brad's done a study of how much you save in electricity, but also in interest costs on the mortgage to buy a new Homestar home. And it really illustrates the point that if we are going to transition to a lot more warm, dry, affordable homes, the key issue is finance and getting the cheapest possible interest rate. Because over time, it really builds up. Over 5 years, buying a Homestar home with that ANZ Green Mortgage will actually save you $9,000 in the 5 years. And you actually get your money back, the extra money you'd pay, within 2 to 3 years. Now, of that $9,000, $6,800 comes from the interest savings, and the rest comes from a lower power bill. So this idea that being green or deciding to pay a tiny bit extra for a house that's more efficient and that's always more expensive, well, it may be upfront, but over the long run, particularly with a slightly lower interest rate, can save you an awful lot of money. Find out this week about saving money and being green at the same time, this week on When the Facts Change. Well, kia ora, and welcome to When the Facts Change to Brad Olson from Infometrics. Fantastic to have you, Brad.
It's great to be here.
You've got some fresh research on energy efficiency and housing, which gives us a bright new horizon of potential cost savings. And just a sort of headline numbers, what sort of savings would you get if you went for a Homestar rated home if you were using a mortgage from a bank?
Yeah, so Infometrics analysis for the New Zealand Green Building Council suggests that sort of at a minimum, over 30 years, you could be saving something like $62,000 on both the mortgage and also the energy costs for a new Homestar 6 house. So you've got to build it slightly above that minimum building code level, but it really does pay off. In fact, it pays off after just a couple of years. Then you start to get some quite strong benefits. I mean, 60K plus is a pretty big number when you're a household paying the mortgage and similar. And it gives you a better lifestyle option out the other side. You're in a healthier home. It's going to be a whole lot airier. It's going to be just better overall. It's good for the planet and it's good for the pocket. And that's sort of a bit of a win.
So let's unpack those numbers a bit to get a sense of where you get the benefits and what the costs are. Because that issue of costs up front versus benefits over a long run is not just a mathematical exercise, it's a sort of a psychological exercise as well. So Homestar Home, can you give us a sense of what's different about it and why it might cost a bit more upfront and how it manages to save energy over the long run?
Yeah, so the likes of Homestar 6 compared to the building code sort of minimums, you're talking about things around the likes of insulation, also sort of continuous ventilation, and a whole bunch of other things. It's not a huge step up, and I think that's why the numbers stack up well enough, is that in terms of additional cost, you're talking 0.5 to 1.5% more on the total cost. Now, that's still a big enough dollar number, but when you're building a new house and you're paying, what, 600-700K minimum on a new build, that sort of 0.5 to 1.5 is not hugely different when it's such an upfront cost. You're already having to pay a whack of money. Adding a little sliver on top doesn't add a huge amount, especially when you can see that payback over time. And so what we've done is we've analysed sort of two components of how this financially stacks up. Firstly, that energy cost. You're saving something like $300 a year at the start, roughly at sort of the minimum level. And that's because you do have that greater level of insulation. You're not having to pay as much for energy because you're keeping more of it in the house rather than letting it escape. You've got that ability that you probably don't have to run a dehumidifier and similar quite as much because you've got better air ventilation and all that sort of thing. At the same time, there's also a mortgage saving that you can have. Now, ANZ offers a loan special discount rate, which means you can get a better mortgage rate than the normal stuff that they and the other banks would offer. And so if you get that special discount off your mortgage, then that's a huge amount of savings. You're talking something like $40,000 out over 30 years. So it is worth it. Obviously, you've got to make sure that the home is built to that standard and gets across the line. But for a smaller increase up front, you get some pretty big gains out over the longer term. And the biggest one for me is that this cost back period, the sort of payback that it takes, you're talking 2 to 3 years. Once you're 3 years in, you've already paid back the upfront cost. Then for the next 27, you're making money.
And that mortgage discount of around about 25 basis points, is that on the extra you're having to pay to make it Homestar or on the whole mortgage?
It's on the whole thing. And that's, I think, the really useful thing is it's not just being a small incentive to try and get you across the line to do a little bit more, renovation extra, a few bits and pieces. This is a whole thing that's coming off. So ANZ's current option is that you get 0.77%, 77 basis points off their standard rate. Given the difference between the standards and the specials, you're looking at an effective 25 basis point difference. Again, doesn't sound like a huge amount, but when you're talking a pretty big loan value, it does make a difference. That's why every time the Reserve Bank cuts by 25 basis points, we care, right? So this does make a material difference looking at things over time. I think also, though, those are the two sort of financial figures that we've looked at. There are other benefits, a lot harder to sort of get through, but you look at the fact we talk a lot about how a lot of Auckland houses are overheating and similar at various times, particularly with more townhouses coming up. Some of those options can be alleviated with those 6 Homestar level ratings because you've got more continuous ventilation and similar. So again, it's a better house that you're getting to start with. You're making money from it over time and you're helping the environment. I mean, it's not often in economics that we seem to get win-win-wins, but this is one of them.
Yeah, and just thinking about how you could apply this to a large group of homes. You mentioned earlier that you'd, in preparing this research, you looked to Australia to see how that's gone, because in Australia, they've been doing this for a bit longer, particularly around solar. And what have they found?
Yeah, I mean, some of the analysis coming out of Australia that's done a similar set of work to what we've done for the New Zealand context does show, again, similar benefits, but even higher than in the New Zealand context because of that sort of solar option that comes through. Now, one of the challenges for New Zealand on the solar front is that we're not doing it quite as much at a household level, and there's also a little bit of limited capacity to put it back into the network. That is changing over time, but I think what we're now starting to see is that everyone is a bit more coordinated to trying to make this work. We've also, though, had a look and highlighted that there are some benefits around doing a 6 Homestar rated home from a developer point of view. You can actually get some better benefits when it comes to finances and better interest rates from the lending on building the stuff in the first place at a larger scale. So I guess through all of this, one, we're wanting to highlight what's happening in this space because there are some clear financial opportunities. I don't feel like it's quite as well known around the traps about sort of where these benefits lie. If you look back into 2020, the latest sort of numbers that we've looked at suggest that only about 13% of homes built and consented in that year were Homestar rated. So these numbers could be a lot bigger given that there are clear financial sort of implications here and it supports better things out the other side. And it's also, I think, we're now into an interesting period where if you ask households what they want to do about the climate, are they worried, do they want to take action? A lot of people say yes, but even more people say, I've got to care about the bottom line. I care about the cost of living, like I'd love to do stuff sustainably, but if it's going to cost me more, that's pretty hard to do when I'm already up against it. So now that we're sort of showing that within a couple of years you have a small upfront increase cost, a much bigger payback over the longer period of time, that should say to households, actually, yes, you can do something sustainable and you actually make it better for your back pocket at the same time. That's, again, I think we were starting to see that shift where people are going, well, if I can make it kill more birds with the one stone, then I'm in a much better spot.
Einstein said the most powerful force in the universe was compounding interest. And we've done some episodes on discounting investment cases, which plays into this really interesting, almost psychological problem we have when we put down a big chunk of money up front for something that's going to give us returns over the long run. And in particular, could you explore or talk about this issue of us valuing chunks of money now so much more than chunks of money in the future, and how people can get around that, trick their own brains, if you like.
Well, I mean, we are short-term creatures, right? And I think part of that's been accelerated, particularly the last 5 years, because of how tricky the economy has been. We've gone through such huge challenges. I don't know if anyone's willing to bank on the fact that in, 5 years, 20 years, 50 years time, they get a sort of better payoff because they're going, geez, I don't know what's coming around the corner tomorrow. Will those same assumptions hold true and similar? Will things actually become a whole lot better? Will I get that bigger dollar figure that I'm promised out in 30 years, or will life change around me? And so, I mean, that's a challenge. But I think also that's why when we're looking at particularly this research, we wanted to figure out how quickly does it make that payoff. And the fact that it comes back within 3 years, I think that's within the right amount of time. Like you just don't get anything that happens within 30 days on the financial front. But for something like 3 years, I think it does say to people that they will see that ability to start making a better return. If they're talking to others who have got a mortgage and similar, that will come through. And it's also, I think, enough time that within that 3 to 5 year period, that's generally when you have, let's call it, a little bit more stability about the direction of travel. In fact, when you talk to most economists, if you talk to most of the banks as well in New Zealand about their forecast horizons, most people do forecasts sort of 5 years out. No more than that, because the entire world will change too much. There'll be big technological shifts, a whole lot of other structural shifts. So 5 years seems to be the sweet spot there around when we're trying to think about some of those bigger, longer term gains. But you're right. This is challenging stuff when it comes to convincing people about sort of making a slightly longer term punt. I totally get that. I think that a big part of that is path dependency. Once you lock yourself into a pathway, it seems a whole lot harder to get out. And although you might sort of see what looks like a rainbow at the end of it, if it's too far away, you're going, well, geez, will I get there? Is there going to be some big roadblock in the path? If you can sort of see with your own two eyes that benefit a lot sooner, even if it's not the full benefit, but just some of it starts to materialize, I think people start to sort of lock themselves into that gain a bit more rather than going, it's a forlorn hope. Will I actually ever get there? Maybe not.
There is a lot of volatility and uncertainty out there, particularly offshore. But you know what? There's some good news. The New Zealand economy is recovering from a deep and painful recession. This year is predicted to be better than last, and 2026 looks even brighter. Lower interest rates are fueling a recovery, easing the cost of living and creating opportunities for businesses. Learn more about New Zealand's positive economic outlook at kiwibank.co.nz.
Hilton brings you new ways to stay, with experiences that let you capture the glory days. Introducing the Graduate Hotels. Each inspired by local college towns, these stays are always original and never boring. Get in touch with traditions all across the country and enjoy a stay that's a class above the rest. Book at Graduate Hotels with Hilton Honors Points at Hilton.com. It's a win-win. Hilton, for the stay.
USAA knows dynamic duos can save the day, like superheroes and sidekicks, or auto and home insurance. With USAA, you can bundle your auto and home and save up to 10%. Visit USAA.com/bundle.
Bundle savings are off total premium, not available in all states or in all situations. To qualify, auto policy must be active prior to property policy issue, subject to change. Restrictions apply. Membership eligibility and product restrictions apply and are subject to change. USAA means United Services Automobile Association and its affiliates, San Antonio, Texas.
So one of the bigger challenges we've got is to reduce our emissions, to reduce our costs of living. And one way to do it is to electrify everything and to insulate and ventilate everything. This is very useful from the point of view of new homes. And at the moment, it's about 30,000 new homes a year are being built. But we've got a housing stock of, depending on who you talk to and how many might actually be lived in, 1.8, 1.9 million homes, some of which are reasonably new and insulated properly, some of which have been retrofitted. We've had government programs, the Warmer Homes program, which have actually used some really interesting research which looks at the costs and benefits for the government of investing some money in insulation, the lowering cost of living for the residents, lowering the health costs for people who aren't being sick anymore. And you start to think, gee, if only we could do this for 1.9 million homes, it would be like buying a couple of power stations for free, if you like, not to mention not having to build a hospital or two. And you wonder how this can be done at a much larger scale and much faster. Can you give us a sense of, what would need to happen if you had a government who was very serious about using a social investment lens to, invest money in, let's say, insulating every home and therefore saving itself, the government and taxpayers, money over the long run, not to mention lowering their costs of living, because the Crown has even lower borrowing costs than a bank and also faces some of the ongoing costs from health, emissions credits, if we ever get around to having to buy them, not to mention the risks of not having enough power in the middle of winter. So can you give us a sense of how you could really scale this up, not just to those 30,000 but to the 1.9 million?
Well, and you're right, it's important. I mean, if we look at New Zealand's emissions profiles, the likes of households contribute 10% of our emissions a year. So if you can make some material changes there, you do start to get, again, sort of quite a big shift. I think, if you look at some of the warmer home stuff that the government has done over time, the cost-benefit numbers on that were sort of staggering. What you were talking, last I looked, something like $7-8 return for every dollar invested. That's a pretty big return, and two, looking through that analysis, that is, like you say, it's quite broad benefits, some very direct obviously to households, but also much wider to the government and similar. And that gives then government more money actually out the other end to invest in a whole lot of other spaces. So there's definitely potential. And I think, one of the things that has been useful over time is that a program like that generally had pretty enduring support from both sides of politics for a longer period. You did actually see that sort of funding continue, I think, through about the sort of early 2010s for about a decade or so. So that stuff is useful. I think what we're starting to see now more, though, is a bit of a challenge around some of those older houses where there's various exemptions or it's too difficult to retrofit some of them. I see that a lot in Wellington. Some of the flats that I have lived in personally, they will never be retrofitted and they've got more black mold in the walls and they'll never have insulation. I think we need to be clear, and I think we have seen this more in the numbers over time, that the sort of demolition rates have been increasing because we are getting rid of older houses and often older, bigger houses on larger plots of land to then build more houses on the same piece. We're being more efficient. Often that actually brings financial benefits too. So I'd be pretty comfortable with doing more of that. Now, yes, it's a little bit, you feel like you're sort of, taking some good value homes or medium value homes and, destroying them to put up something different. But really, if it gives that sort of healthier benefit, I'm more on board with that. But yes, we should totally be looking at some of those changes over time so that we can retrofit, we can put more insulation in. And I think just having a recurring line item for government where that's a continual program that, as long as it continues to make that sort of financial benefit, it continues to come through. You mentioned the likes of the health benefits. That is a real tangible one for government. We know at the moment how much A, health is costing, and two, or B, how challenging it is to provide those services. If you've got more and more people who are going there for a snuffly nose and everything else, and if you can wipe that out and limit that ability to go to hospitals and other medical centres, geez, you're onto a big financial winner. So yes, should government be investing more in that? Totally. Borrowing costs are a whole lot lower. But I think as well, I don't want to discount the fact that the private sector can and should be doing more of this. Like it's not an either or, it's a everyone should be. And I was a little bit surprised that only one of the major banks was doing something specific for something like Homestar 6. And look, everyone is talking a big talk right in the climate space. Everyone wants to be doing more. This is a very easy way to provide, from a bank perspective, it's pretty limited. It's 25 bips. It's not huge, and we know that there's enough, returns that are being made in the banking sector. This is an area where you really can start to incentivize some homeowners and house builders to do a bit more. So I'd look at all of that and go, if people are serious about wanting to make a difference to the environment, and I know a lot of people that are, and if one of the reservations is, can I make it financially stack up? Because if I can't, it makes my life too difficult. Here is the option. You can do both. You can be good for the planet, good for the pocket. Again, match made in heaven.
One of the interesting things about our housing market now is about 65% or so own their own home, and we've got 700,000 or 800,000 private rentals. And the benefits for the funder of this, the owner of the home who is taking the mortgage out and is paying the interest on the mortgage, they are captured at least partially because they get a lower interest rate, but they don't necessarily get a lower cost of living in that home because that's captured by the tenant. How much of an issue is that or is there a way around that for landlords or a policy idea which would mean that 600,000 or 700,000 homes and new private rentals are also encouraged to do this?
I think there's 2 points there. One is that, yes, as a landlord, you might not get the lower cost yourself, but you probably command a higher premium relative to another rental because it's a better home. And look, as a tenant myself at the moment, trust me, if I was having to cast about for a home, again, I look at the likes of Wellington, something that was nice and warm and dry and new and had a heat pump and all that sort of stuff and was well insulated, I would be happy to pay a bit more money to not get sick and not feel like I was sort of living in the middle of Antarctica all the time. Like that stuff does matter. So you can get a price premium on that. I think also, and this is where I think some of the healthy home standards were important, there is, I think, a reasonable expectation that you have a minimum level of this stuff. And the likes of Homestar 6 and similar does go a pitch above that. But I think as well, I remember when healthy homes weren't in place, and it was totally okay to have black mold in homes. Sometimes it still is because people aren't willing to speak up and similar. I personally think that is absolutely wrong. Like, again, the fact that, as a rental, you don't have that many rights and abilities there that you can always collect on. It's a whole lot harder, even if you do have legal obligations and legal rights and that, it's hard to get them worked through because, oftentimes we've found in the past that landlords have a bit more power than renters. So having an absolute minimum standard here, I think, is a little bit of a basic human right element. Like, we're not saying that everyone should live in a gold-plated mansion. Let's be absolutely clear. But I think you look at some parts of the country, you look at most of the South Island, how cold it gets down there. I'm sorry, having a form of heating, absolute basic necessity, and anyone that says that they don't should go and have to live in one of those things for a year and figure out how bad it is. So I think there is a bit of a minimum standard here. And if you look as well, increasingly we know that there is a greater demand as well for rentals that's starting to come through in some areas over time. And that's sort of through a shift in a whole bunch of things. People have been living more intergenerationally. Housing has been harder to afford over times. We did see a jump in the home ownership rate at the 23 census. That's for sure. The first time in I think about 30 years. There's still a lot of renters in New Zealand. The population is growing, and so number-wise, it's going up. What that means, I think, going forward is that for landlords, they're still going to want to make sure they are competitive in the market. And so there is a financial incentive for them to provide a good option. Yes, it might cost them a bit more, but trust me, having a house that you can't fill and can't rent out, that'll cost you a whole lot more again.
And is there any research on how much of a premium these sorts of homes could get? If you're a landlord and you're thinking, gee, if I could get $5 or $10 a week, that would make the difference.
I haven't seen any specific numbers out there, but I think it's fairly clear in some of the demand and supply figures that you start to see. And certainly when you talk to people in the sector that, the levels of demand, the sort of clicks and people showing up to open homes or rental open homes and that for some of those better dwellings are certainly quite hot. The place that I live in at the moment, which is a fairly nice townhouse, it's got a heat pump and similar in it. A few years back when we did, have a flatmate who moved out, we needed to bring someone else in, had a lot more attention than it did probably last time when it didn't have a heat pump. So, those things do matter. And you're starting to see that as well when coming through in some of the numbers, the likes of the heat pump proportions across the housing stock in the last census, is becoming increasingly high. We're starting to get on top of some of those mouldy, damp homes that are coming through. So I do think that there is progress emerging, and I think for landlords, it is one of those areas where in some areas it might not be that having these things definitely commands you a sort of direct premium, but it might well be like billboards and election campaigns that if you don't have it, makes it pretty hard to rent out.
Brad Olsen from Infometrics, thank you so much for coming on to When the Facts Change.
It's been lovely to chat.
When the Facts Change was brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network, together with KiwiBank. Visit kiwibank.co.nz to find out how KiwiBank are making Kiwi better off.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.